Coney Island literally translates to Rabbit Island, and then eventually it was anglicized. When you look on the old maps, it clearly says Rabbit Island in Dutch. Back in the 1500s, the first European explorers, the first Europeans in general to set foot on what would become Coney Island, as far as we know it, was Verrazano, who the Verrazano Bridge was named after. Next was Henry Hudson, who the Hudson River was named after. In the 1600s, Anthony Janzoon van Sally owned Gravesend and New Utrecht. Now, Coney Island was part of Gravesend. He also, by the way, owned areas in the Bowery in Lower Manhattan. The son of Jan Janzoon, who was a Dutch pirate, whose mother was actually a Moor. He was held captive in a Muslim country. He actually converted to Islam. His father, that is, Jan Janzoon. Coney Island became a pseudo-vacation destination for wealthy people. That's how they marketed it, as like, oh, it's so far away from Manhattan. So hotels began to spring up, the wealthy began to populate. In the late 1800s, when ferry service opened up, then the middle class began to make their way down to Coney Island. And a couple businessmen got together and built a huge hotel, which they called Brighton Beach. That was the name of the hotel. And it was for the upper middle class. The working class and the quote-unquote lower classes, what would be considered the lower classes, were on the western portion of the island. Because remember, Coney Island was actually, right now, if you can visualize Coney Island is a peninsula, but it was originally a bunch of smaller islands. Each island had its individual name. That land was filled in later, where now it's a peninsula, but it was originally small individual islands. So during the western portion, that's where the quote-unquote working class were. And also crime began to boost around this time. Around the middle area of the peninsula is where they built the Brighton Beach Hotel. And then a little further east, on the eastern end, another group of investors got together and built an even more luxurious hotel and named that one Manhattan Beach. So it was the three of them competing. It's interesting because this is how these places are actually areas now. Brighton Beach is its own neighborhood, and Manhattan Beach is its own neighborhood, but that's where they got their names from. That was the origin of these neighborhoods. They each started as hotels. We consider Coney Island would be West Brighton, and they won over because of their spectacular amusement areas, which is where the whole Coney Island amusement park movement came out of. They just began to build on that. Then when the Brooklyn Bridge went up in the early 20th century, it was over. Coney Island became the top amusement area in the whole United States. The Cyclone and the Wonder Wheel went up in the 1920s. And just recently, in the late 1980s, they actually got landmark status. They were marked officially historical landmarks. But those went up in the 1920s. Then when the 1960s rolled around, there was a steep decline, starting with the World Fair, which was in 1964-65 in Flushing Meadows Park. So the summertime traffic began to decrease, and it just took a nosedive. Eventually, all the amusement parks in Coney Island closed. They were even thinking about demolishing the Cyclone to extend the New York Aquarium. And it wasn't looking good. Crime was just out of control, particularly violent murder. And this is around the time 1979 when they made the famous, iconic, one of my favorite movies, The Warriors, about a gang from Coney Island and, you know, the rest. Then when the late 90s and 2000s rolled around, the city began to invest in the revitalization of Coney Island. They got their own minor league baseball team, the Brooklyn Cyclones, and a stadium to go with it.